Hello everyone, this is Ayushi Gupta. Welcome to the 36th episode of Microsoft Hour of Code brought to you by Millionlights. Millionlights is a TV channel dedicated to improving the skills of people and their employability. Now let me tell you a little more about the Microsoft Hour of Code. Microsoft Hour of Code is a series of lectures, courses, and talks by experts who are going to discuss the latest Microsoft technology topics related to programming and industry forecasts that are all focused on employability. As you know, we are learning JavaScript Fundamentals. This content has been created by our partner Microsoft. We have Bob Tabor from Microsoft with us, who is going to teach you the fundamentals of JavaScript programming. But before we start, you need to have a computer system with a 64-bit processor or a 32-bit processor. Other required tools are Windows Notepad and any web browser such as Internet Explorer. Let me tell you what we have covered so far in the previous episodes of this course. Introduction, writing your first JavaScript application, dissecting the first JavaScript application you wrote, writing JavaScript in Visual Web Developer Express Edition, JavaScript variables, types, operators, and expressions, conditional logic in JavaScript, JavaScript functions, JavaScript arrays, looping statements in JavaScript, understanding function versus global scope, working with external JavaScript files, organizing and simplifying JavaScript with object literals, understanding the document object model, and getting started with jQuery. jQuery selectors, jQuery events, installing and utilizing jQuery plugins. If you think you missed any one of these courses and want to rewatch it, you can simply visit our website www.millionlights.org and get it from there. In this episode, we will cover Module 18, Unobtrusive JavaScript, using jQuery to revive JSON via Ajax, fundamentals of JavaScript closures and module, series wrap-up. So let's get started.
Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this video, we'll talk about unobtrusive JavaScript, which is really just a set of principles that experienced JavaScript developers have been teaching and preaching and promoting for quite a few years now. These are considered the best practices for aspiring JavaScript developers, and I want to make sure that you're at least aware of these things and at a minimum that we're following these sorts of things moving forward. So there's a group called the Web Standards Project, and they describe 4 benefits of writing unobtrusive JavaScript. The benefits are usability, graceful degradation, accessibility, and separation. Usability is in regards to the fact that the script shouldn't call attention to itself. It should just work. Users should be using it without even thinking about it. Graceful degradation is kind of the other side of the coin, that if it doesn't work, then it should just fail silently and go away and disappear and never call attention to itself. Accessibility has to do with whether it works across all devices for all people. If the script fails, the page will still deliver its core content via markup style sheets or server-side scripting, so the JavaScript is not required in order to consume the content. And then finally, the separation of concerns like we talked about previously. For the benefit of other and future web developers, all JavaScript code should be maintained separately without impacting other files of script, markup, or code. So there are some basic techniques that have been developed through the years to achieve these principles, and we're just going to look at 3 of them. There might be a few more, but these are the easiest ones we can kind of apply at this point in our knowledge of JavaScript. There's separation of behavior from markup, there's namespaces, also known as global abatement, and then degrading gracefully, which we'll look at the very end. So the separation of behavior from markup, we've already kind of talked about this, how we should keep our JavaScript and our HTML in separate files, in separate places. Otherwise, the HTML and the JavaScript, they all get tangled together. And I've used this term, separation of concerns, before. It's a programming term. It's the first step towards writing unobtrusive JavaScript by keeping the behavior in its own files and the content or the markup in its own files, and so on. So we're not going to go into that in any more depth. We're already kind of doing that whenever we use the src, the source equals javascript 18.js, for example. We're keeping that JavaScript in its own file. All right, the second one requires a little bit more explanation, the concept of namespaces or global abatement. By default, whenever you're writing JavaScript functions and declaring variables, you're doing so in the global namespace or at a global level, or we called it the global scope before. So as a result, it's entirely possible that the names that you choose for your variables and for your functions are potentially going to collide with other code that was written at the global level as well, that you may have imported into the page or that coworkers were working on. This is especially dangerous when you're writing library code that's intended for use in multiple projects, or importing libraries that are created by other developers who are not so thoughtful as you need to be. So when you create variables and functions at the global level, it's often referred to as polluting the global namespace. That word namespace refers to the domain or the scope. So you're potentially polluting or sticking your stuff in the global scope by adding your names for variables and functions in there. And the solution to this is easy. You create an object that contains all of your code. This object sits at the global level, the global scope, but it's the only thing that you as a developer add to the global scope. Everything else becomes a property of that global object that you create. So basically, you're just reducing your footprint in the global namespace by sticking everything in an object specific to your module, your code, your plugin, whatever the case might be. Okay? So let me show you kind of what was popular a few years ago and why it's bad. And that is, we kind of called old school. It clutters up the namespace. So let's go to our script18.js file that I've already got set up here. First of all, let's just make sure that this even runs at this point. All right, so we've got that part working. Great. So in the past, you may have done something like this and not even really thought a whole lot about it. What you're really doing, even though you're using the var keyword, it's still var to the global because we haven't put it inside of a function. So, for example, if we change this alert, and we know that window is the global object, if we go window.version, we should see 1.2 pop up. And that's a bad thing, because what we've done is polluted our global namespace with the word version. Now, anybody else who tries to use the word version, either it's going to overwrite what we've done or we're going to overwrite what they've done. So that's bad news, especially as you begin to add a dozen, 2 dozen, hundreds of variables at this level. Instead, what you should be doing is this. You should first of all declare a global object. We're going to call it Atris, and then you start attaching things to it. Atris is just maybe a project name that I'm working on. Notice that it's in all caps. That should be a clue when I'm looking at the code or somebody else that this is a global object. All right. And so I'll do this instead. Now, if we were to run our code, this alert window.version, see what happens. You'll notice that the variable is undefined because it's not found in the global namespace. That's awesome. However, if we were to do this, it gives us the value again. Great. So what this is called is a singleton pattern. We've created a single object at the global level, and then everything we do from this point on will be attached to that global object. So for example, suppose we take an example from something we've worked on in the past with this like planet object that we created. We have an object planet, and we want to use it throughout our application. And I could go in and create all of its methods and properties. I'll just keep it simple for now. The problem with this is that it's polluting the global namespace. What I should be doing instead is that. So I can do atris.planet.name. in order to access that property. Okay? Simple concept, It's just being aware of what the issue is and how do we avoid cluttering up or polluting the global namespace. Yes, we do have a foothold in the global namespace, but it's our only foothold. It's the only thing that we do to clutter it all up. So there's also another way to accomplish this. We call this a singleton pattern, where we create a global object and then attach everything to that global object. There's another pattern called the module pattern, very popular in JavaScript, a little bit of an advanced concept, but it allows you to define private and public members. We're not going to talk about that now, but I would encourage you, if you have any interest in moving forward in your career, you start looking at JavaScript patterns, things that are used often in JavaScript, and the module pattern is one of the most popular. So one final caveat here before we move on. For simple jQuery-based applications like we've been working on, I'm going to keep all of my work inside of the ready method right in here, right where we have the alert. So for example, if I were to want to create this, let me comment everything else out. And let's go ahead and just put that up here ahead of it. Using this window, again, will ensure that we're not attaching this version variable to the global. We're attaching it to jQuery instead. So if I did this right, let's see. So the good news here is that I have avoided the global namespace by keeping everything just inside of my jQuery ready function instead. All right. Now, if I need a function to be called outside of the scope of this document.ready, then I have no choice but to do as I demonstrated here, and that is to create my own namespace and then attach my functions and objects and variables to that namespace. But for most of my simple examples, I won't be creating my own namespace. I'm just going to be putting my code inside of jQuery's ready method. If I'm working on a larger application that involves more complexity and more developers, then I'm going to be thinking more seriously about having a strategy involving one or more namespaces. Now, ideally, just one namespace. Any more namespaces than that, I'm going to potentially be colliding with other libraries or libraries or code that my team members have created. So now we're moving into advanced territory here again, and the answers to questions when it comes to larger applications and how do you structure code and how do you utilize design patterns is often, it really depends on the situation. So I would encourage you to grow towards learning more about JavaScript and JavaScript patterns, especially for larger applications when you have the need to do that. But let's move on for now. Finally, we want to talk about degrading gracefully, and let me get started here by just getting rid of everything up to this point. Okay, we'll just do our work inside of there and kind of ignore everything else. Okay. And degrading gracefully has to do with thinking about your use of JavaScript and how it impacts the web page should somebody turn the JavaScript off in their web browser. So when manipulating the document object model, you should be careful to not require the JavaScript to run in order for the user to use the web page. So you as the developer need to ensure that added behavior degrades gracefully on those browsers with unexpected configurations and on those on which the user may have disabled JavaScript altogether. So making your application accessible for people of all abilities and disabilities is both a good idea for business, and in some countries it's even the law, like in the UK. It requires that you think about the ramifications of using a really slick user interface and how it would behave if you were to have no JavaScript available whatsoever. The JavaScript should be additive. It should be a bonus for those with a computing platform to utilize it, but not a requirement. And so there's a simple way to demonstrate this, and that is through the use of the document.write, which we've used quite a few times here in our applications. If you're going to do all of your work in document.write, and I've seen applications that have overutilized document.write to spit out content to the web page dynamically. The problem with this is that if the user turns off the JavaScript, there won't be anything spit out to the web page. So that is a very simplified example. Now, we were using that because we were just wanting to learn JavaScript, and it was an easy way to just send some output. But hopefully you don't get in the habit of using that. Instead, you get in the habit of thinking of the ramifications of your JavaScript should somebody had turned it off in their browser. All right, so let me show you another example, maybe a little more real-life example of a simple show-hide scenario. There are a lot of web pages that will show and hide information based on whether you've clicked a little plus symbol to open it and then a little minus symbol to close it back. It's a slick little thing you can add to a web page, but it should under no circumstances be relied on for the main presentation of your content. And to kind of demonstrate this, you can see that I've set this up by creating a paragraph with the ID of main, and it has an image, a plus image inside of it. You may have already seen it as we've opened up this web page. And the idea here, we'll get rid of that in a second, the idea here is that you would click on the plus symbol to show a message and then hide it using the minus symbol. And there's a right way and a wrong way to implement this. Let me show you the wrong way to do this first. Make sure we save this. And inside of here, let me reference the click me element, and when you click it, and so we'll want to append So let's see how this works. Okay, so you should only see this if you click the plus. Now what happens if we were to go to Internet Options, Advanced, and let's go ahead and turn off JavaScript. Click Apply and OK. Refresh the page. Now, well, let's go ahead and shut down the browser and start over again. That's probably what we need to do. All right, notice that we get that allow block content. No, we're not going to allow it. And now the content never will make it to screen because we have JavaScript turned off. That's the wrong way to handle this situation. So ideally what we're going to do instead is to kind of take the opposite approach. Instead of displaying the plus in the page, let's rip that out of the page. And then we're going to create the message. You should see this whether JavaScript is on or off. Let's save that. Let's go back to our script and let's just let's comment this out. First things first, what I want to do is if somebody in fact does have JavaScript turned on, then I will show the image. Let's go ahead and use double quotes around this. Then if somebody clicks on that image, we'll call it the toggle method. And the great thing about the toggle is that it will just switch between two states. So we need to give it two anonymous functions here. All right, and in the on state, we're going to show the message. Whoops, I need to do that. And as an added bonus, I'm even going to change from the plus image to the minus image. And these images should be available in the folder where you've downloaded this code. Okay, if I haven't already said that, I apologize. All right, and then on the opposite state, what we'll do is we're going to hide slow. I forgot that. And we'll change it back to a plus then. Then, as we start up, we want to hide the message. And what this does for us, it'll only hide the message if JavaScript is turned on. It will only display the image if JavaScript is turned on. It will only toggle if JavaScript is turned on. Otherwise, the message will show up and display regardless. And that's what we want. Okay, so let's test it in this case first, and then we'll come back and fix anything that I may have done wrong here. So let's start over. All right, so as you can see, you should see this whether JavaScript is on or off. Great. Now if we were to allow block content, you should see this whether JavaScript is on or off. Okay, and I'm missing my minus dash 8 PNG. Let me see if I called it something wrong. Minus, whoops, dash 8 PNG. Save that, start that over. So now this will work in either scenario. Pretty cool. Pretty happy about that. Okay, so there's more to writing unobtrusive JavaScript, but hopefully you can see how these three techniques will help you achieve the desired results, namely usability, graceful degradation, accessibility, and separation of concerns. All right, so we're doing great. You're learning a ton about JavaScript. Hopefully it's starting to all click for you. We're going to continue pushing forward in the next lesson. See you there. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to retrieve data from a web server in a JavaScript format called JSON via a technology called AJAX using jQuery. A lot of terminology flying around there. Let's start with AJAX. It stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It's basically a way to transfer data between a web page and a web server without having to do a full page refresh using an HTTP GET or an HTTP POST. So you don't have to do a full page refresh in order to send data back and forth between the page and the server. It all looks rather seamless, like you're in a very rich environment working with your web page. And a lot of websites use AJAX today. That's kind of a technology that's been around for quite some time. What's new and interesting is how you can use jQuery to simplify that process. So the way jQuery works with making AJAX requests is that it will make a request, allow your JavaScript to say, hey, send me some information, and then you register a function. You say, when that data comes back, execute this function. So then it allows the user of the application continue working. Once the data does come back successfully, then things on the web page can change because that function will fire off and you can update the web page with new data from the web server, whatever the case might be. So that's the asynchronous part. You set up a function, a callback, I guess you could say, that will execute once the data comes down successfully. The XML part of AJAX is a bit of a misnomer because nowadays, instead of sending XML back and forth between the web page and the server, most developers prefer to send JSON around, JSON. And the benefit is that it's a JavaScript object syntax that you can work with more easily as a JavaScript developer. So that brings us to what JSON stands for. It's JavaScript Object Notation. It's a lightweight format for transferring data. So take a look at this file that I've created. It has a very simple example. It follows the syntax of an object literal that we've been using up to now with an open and closed curly brace, and then you define a property name or an attribute name and then its value, and then you use a comma to separate it from the next name value pair, okay, or key value pair. And now usually the data is being generated dynamically from like a database using some web server technology like ASP.NET or PHP or what have you. However, in this case, I just want to keep things simple. I don't want to talk about the server side of things. I'm just creating a hard-coded file called data19.json, and we'll just request this, and it'll bring back this object whenever we click a link, for example, in our web page. Okay, so let me close that down for now. You can see that I've already set up my example. c9js_19.html is what we've come accustomed to. The only difference here, well, you can see first of all I've got a reference to jQuery, I've got a reference to my script19.js, and then in the body of my web page I have an anchor tag with an href set to just a pound sign, which means don't go anywhere, just stay here. All we're trying to do is collect a click event for this hyperlink that's been defined as getJSON data. All right, so to begin with, let's make sure that our example is actually running and connected to our script19.js file, and it seems to be just fine. As you would expect, I just have my simple ready function here defined, and I'll go ahead and get rid of the got here alert. So what we want to do is create an example where when somebody clicks that link, that anchor that has an ID of click me, we want to fire off function. And so what we want to do is use the getJSON method of jQuery in order to request data from a web server. Now in this case, again, we're just going to hard code that URL to, what do we call that, data19.json. All right, but then what we need to do is set up a callback function, if you will, that will fire once the data is successfully retrieved from the web server. Now inside of this, what we want to do is grab the data that is going to be returned. getJSON will send our callback function the data that it retrieves from the URL. So that's what we're going to be working with. And what we want to do is take that data and get it into a format that we can display nicely on our web page. So there's a couple of different ways we go about this. I'm just going to use a technique that I saw on jQuery's own documentation. I'm going to use the jQuery each utility function, which allows me to iterate over a JavaScript collection. This data is just a JavaScript object used as a collection, or some people call it a map, containing a number of objects comprised of a key and associated value. So the jQuery each function allows me to define a callback function, and for each JavaScript object contained in the data collection, the callback function will be passed the key and associated value of that given object. So what we'll do inside of here is use our items array that we've defined. We call this items. So we have this items array that we've defined, and what we want to do is add items to the end of that array. So I'm going to use this push method, which will add new items to the end of the array. Pretty cool. And what I want to do is pass in the key and the value in some way. What I'm going to do is wrap these values in some HTML. So we'll start off with a series of list items, and each of them will have an ID. And so for the ID, I want to use the key. And then I'm going to add the value here. That'll be visible. So the key will be the ID, and then the value will be visible inside of the list item. There's a lot going on here with single quotes and double quotes. Just make sure you take your time and type this in correctly. The double quotes are going to be needed to surround the key. The single quotes are going to be what differentiates each of the three literal strings and allows us to append them to the key and the value using the plus operators. All right, so just take your time and make sure you get that right, or else you're going to get some weird results. All right, so after our each statement, we built up this this collection of items, and now we want to take that collection of items, that list, that array of items, and we're going to spit them out into HTML. And the way we're going to do this, we're going to do it all in one line using another feature of jQuery that we haven't looked at up to this point. Oops. So up to now, if I wanted to get at an individual item, I would just pass in a literal string some CSS3 selector. There's another way that we can use the jQuery object, and that is by passing in a tag we haven't used yet. We can construct a new tag from scratch. So inside here, we're going to configure our new tag and then append it to our body. And so we'll get to that in just a moment here. So let's open it up and close up a new object literal. And inside of there, I'm going to set some properties of this new unordered list that I'm constructing from scratch. So I'm going to give it a class, for example, and that class will just be interest list. And then I want to give it its inner HTML, and I'm going to set that to, I'm going to take my items and I'm going to call a join method. So we've used items.push, and now we're using items.join. And what join will do is take each element of the array and just concatenate them together. And if we wanted to concatenate them together and separate them with a comma, we can pass in like a comma, for example, in a literal string. But in this case, I don't want anything to separate them. So I'm just going to pass in an empty string with no space or anything between it. All right, so now I have this. I'm going to take this newly constructed unordered list, complete with a class and the HTML that we've been constructing from this statement as we've gone through each item from our data, okay? And I'm going to call append to, and I'm going to append it to our body tag. So we're just basically adding that list to our body. So let's go ahead and save this and see if it works. We've done a ton of typing and no testing, and that makes me nervous. All right, so awesome. It's gone out, grabbed the data from presumably across the world, but in reality just from our own hard drive. It has, let's use the F12 developer tools here and just kind of see what we get. Notice that it's created a new unordered list with the class of interest list with near a number of list items with each with the ID that we would come to expect, and those were set up for us. Those are the keys from our data19.json file, and then we see the value as a text as a child of the list item. Great. That worked just fine. Now there is one little problem with using getJSON. The beauty of it is its simplicity. It allows us to set things up very quickly and easily. Downside is that if we were to have an issue with the web server, or if for some reason it can't find the JSON, notice what happens when we re-execute our web page. Nothing happens at all. No error message, nothing. And so that's the downfall of the JSON, of the getJSON method. Fortunately, there is a replacement for this, a longer version. Let me just comment all of this out and kind of start over this example, because we're going to need to use the more complicated form if we really want the robust features of our AJAX calls. So we're going to have to use the AJAX method in jQuery. All right, so it's going to allow us to set up, for example, using a object literal, the URL that we want to pull from. So here again, this is going to be data19.json. We want the data type to be JSON, and there's some other options in this regard like XML. When a success happens, then we're going to define a callback function, passing in the data, and we're just going to copy and paste what we did before there, so we don't have to rewrite all of this stuff. So if you'll forgive me for just a moment here, I'm going to copy all of that. stick it right there. All right. Now the problem with pasting in, sometimes it's hard to tell what belongs to what. But I think that would do it there. And if, for example, there was some sort of issue, then we can capture it. So say, for example, there's a 404, we can, which means the location was not found, we can pop up an alert box. All right, so let me make sure here that this all lines up the way that I would hope for it to. All right, and this is the trickiest part when you start getting so deeply nested with so many curly braces. Sometimes it's difficult to see what you've done, and I'm not even completely confident that I've done this correctly. We may have an error in our jQuery here, but let's just try and see what we get. Okay, that seemed to work. Awesome. And now what happens when it can't find the file, like the test case previously? We change the file name, we rerun the example, and we don't get the results we were hoping for. Maybe the problem was not a 404 error. Let's try and see what we do get here. Whoops, our script. No clues. And the reason why we're not going to get anything is because we're not going to get a 404 from our hard drive. That's only served up from a web server. So unfortunately, this example may have been doomed from the start. If we were to copy this example and put it on a real web server that could deliver us a 404, we might have a little more success here. Oh well, I didn't think that through until I started recording this video. But you can go ahead and copy this up if you have access to a web server, and it hopefully would work. But the good news is that it would allow us to check for the error code and then handle the case where there was some problem returned back from the web server that would not allow us to continue this this operation of parsing out the data that was returned. Okay, so at any rate, that is how you retrieve JSON data using AJAX via jQuery. Hopefully I didn't confuse anybody. This is not a requirement, but as your skills progress, you will definitely want to use JavaScript and jQuery to communicate with a back-end web server, and this is probably the easiest way to do it. All right, doing great. Let's continue moving forward. We'll see you in the next video. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we'll talk about this slightly more advanced topic of closures in JavaScript. I see this popping up quite a bit in forum posts, mainly because I think people are just trying to figure out what the heck is a closure and how can I use it in my applications. Seems that there's a lot of fuss about closures with regards to JavaScript, and I think it's important to show you what the fuss really is all about. But as you're getting started, I would caution you against trying to shoehorn closures into your programming style. After you've had some experience working with JavaScript and you're working perhaps on a larger project, I suspect you'll have this aha moment where you'll realize, hey, closures could actually make the code that I'm writing much more elegant. And at that point, I think it'll become obvious to you why you need them. Now, since closures is an advanced feature, it's difficult for me to demonstrate closures in a way that's small enough and trivial enough to fit it in a small video, and yet practical enough to demonstrate how it can be useful or why you should be using it. So I want to emphasize that while you're watching this video, you should be striving to understand what closures are conceptually, not necessarily even how to use them or why you would want to use it. That's something I believe that will become obvious to you once you become more experienced in JavaScript development. I'm sorry, that's the best that I can offer right now. Also, I think it would be easier to show you how they work rather than start with this long explanation of what they are. All right, so all those caveats are out of the way. Let's start with a simple example, and we'll build on it to fully explain what a closure is and why it's significant in JavaScript. So you can see that I've already started off by creating our HTML page, c9js_20.html, using our template. You can see that I've added a script reference to our jQuery library and a script reference to script20.js. The only other interesting thing about this HTML page is that I have an anchor tag with an ID of buildCat and some random text here that's not important. So take a moment, pause the video, and catch up if you need to. Let's switch over and take a look now at script 20. I've created a simple example. This is not a closure, but it's a starting point that we can build on. And let me explain what's going on here. And again, pause the video if you need to type this in, or if you like, just copy it from the files that I've supplied that accompany this lesson. So inside of our jQuery ready function, we're defining, first of all, a function, buildACat, and then we'll execute that buildACat whenever somebody clicks on that that anchor tag with the ID of buildCat that we looked at a moment ago. What's interesting is this function buildACat. This buildACat function starts off by creating a functionally scoped variable called catName, and that catName will be used inside of an inner function called catFactory. In fact, when buildACat is executed, the first thing that happens is the variable name will be assigned, then catFactory will be executed, which will then execute this method that merely pops open an alert box displaying the cat name from our functionally scoped catName variable. Okay? So let's see this in action first of all to get started. Make sure I have everything saved. And then let's open it up in Internet Explorer. And I click on this number that's passed in. So it'll set the document.body.style.font size equal to 12px or 14px or 16px. Then this next little section of JavaScript is where it actually makes that call, passing in 12, 14, and 16, and stores those in closures. Now this closure has both the implementation as well as the data, and it stores it in a nice little small package, this nice little closure. From this point on, all I need to do is check the onClick event of each of my anchor tags that are defined here. And when you click on the size 14 ID, for example, it's going to call the onClick event and set that onClick event equal to size 14, this closure that has encapsulated both the implementation as well as the 14px font size. That's what allows us to get lots of functionality here in a very small package. And it's a very concise example of using closures. Okay, so to recap, a closure is simple. It's just a special type of object in JavaScript that combines a function and its implementation along with the environment in which that function was created. Any local variables or input arguments are all combined together, and then you can use that closure, that reference to the function and data, throughout the remainder of your JavaScript code. It's as simple as that. How you use it, why you use it, that's the topic for another day. Okay, so I'm going to have a little bit more to say in closing for this entire series, but if you made it this far and you've worked your way through the examples like I've demonstrated on screen, then I have to think that you have at least a more full understanding. I hope it was beneficial to you. I hope you've enjoyed this series. There's a lot of work to work through hours and hours of listening to somebody talk, especially about technical type of subjects. So if you made it this far, awesome. Congratulations. Stick with me. I got one more lesson. I'll give you some things that you could look out for and maybe where to go from here in the very next video. We'll see you there. Thank you. Okay, so we made it through the entire series. If you watched the entire thing from beginning to end, congratulations. That's awesome. Sure, there's a lot more to learn, but you've taken some huge steps towards mastering the language and getting all this under your belt, so that is just great. In this last video, I want to give you a roadmap where I think you could go from here. Then I'm going to answer one of the most common questions that I get in Channel 9 comments. Which book should I buy? And you realize when you ask that, it hurts my feelings, right? I'm just kidding. It does help to own reference books. Clearly, I have a number of them myself. Life has many teachers in many different contexts. Videos have their place in the learning process, as do books, in-class training, and so on. So first of all, let's start with the roadmap. Let me talk about the things that I didn't talk about in this series and that you may want to investigate a little bit more on your own. We didn't talk about built-in methods for string manipulation, how to chop apart a string, grab different parts of a string, concatenate strings together in various ways. We didn't talk about any of the built-in math functions available in JavaScript. We didn't talk about any of the built-in functions for arrays. Now I use one or two examples here and there, but there are more and I didn't really talk about them at length. So that's probably a good place for you to start your investigation and learn more. We talked about the document object model at length, but there's even more details available. More events, more built-in methods to learn. Perhaps you could go down the path of learning about the idiosyncrasies between popular browsers. One huge topic that we didn't talk about is building metro-style applications with JavaScript and WinRT. And I foresee this being a place where you could really make a name for yourself in the coming years. There's more information forthcoming from Microsoft at the time of this recording, so I'm sure we'll be investigating that together soon. We didn't talk about how to structure large JavaScript projects, like where do you put the code. We talked about namespaces and how that allows us to split code up into multiple files, but we really didn't demonstrate any examples of large-scale JavaScript-based projects, so that would be another place to investigate. Oh, and there's so much to learn about jQuery, more selectors, more events. We didn't talk about how to create your own plugins. Those are all good places to investigate further. And then we can talk about and jump off in a whole other number of directions with other libraries like MooTools and Dojo and YUI and EXTJS and PhoneGap, just to name a few. There are dozens more to choose from, so learning the libraries that are available and what they do for you could be a significant way to spend months, if not years, of your life in JavaScript. Now, in my opinion, more importantly than learning the individual libraries and what they do differently, I think learning common design patterns in JavaScript, understanding even more about the internal implementation of JavaScript and how it works best, and so how to structure your code to take advantage of some of those things. And to that end, there are a number of books that are available. Before we get to the more complicated books, let me start with something I feel like would be appropriate for an absolute beginner or somebody who's gotten to this point, maybe to reinforce what you're learning or to push you a little bit further. And that is this JavaScript. The one that I have is the second edition. There might be a later edition by the time you're watching this video, but I like the layout of generally of the Microsoft Press books. I like the code examples that were used, the range of topics that are available, the way that it's split up, the exercises that are available. So I think this is a great beginner level book that will push you beyond what you learned in this video series, or at the very least reinforce some of those things that we talked about. Beyond the basics, the definitive guide, quite literally, is this book by Flanagan. It's in its 6th edition. I think I've owned 3 or 4 of the 6 editions. It's quite a weighty tome, quite large. I don't think you would ever get all the way through it, but as a reference book, it's very valuable. The challenge with this book is that it's not very beginner friendly, at least in my opinion. It does not seek to, how should we say, make the topic easier to understand. It dives deep into the implementation details. So while it's challenging, it's also the most rewarding if you do put the time in and learn it. Along those lines, this book by Crockford, who's considered, I wouldn't say the father of JavaScript necessarily, but he's definitely deep in the implementation of, for example, the YUI library, and he understands the internals very well, considered an expert in this regard. He's written this very thin book. It's light on details for the easy stuff, but heavy on details for the more complicated stuff. And so instead of being a reference book, it's more of a commentary on JavaScript, and it's definitely a good to have. Another book, once you get past that, is to look at JavaScript patterns. These books all by O'Reilly Press. And when we talked about the module pattern, for example, just one of several different patterns that are available in JavaScript, and coming to know that really represents a mastery of JavaScript. Okay. In regards to jQuery, the first two books that I purchased are really, in my opinion, still the best. They're written both by the same author. Learning jQuery by, let's see what their names are. Yeah, Schaefer and Svedberg, I believe is how you pronounce his name. I apologize if I get it wrong. But they're both very active in the jQuery forums. You'll see their names popping up often in the documentation, like in the Discus comments below. And then also the jQuery reference. These are the first editions of both of these books, and I believe that they have newer editions available now. So at any rate, that's what I would recommend in terms of books, and there are plenty more to choose from. If you're ever unsure, just do what I do. Look at the comments, the feedback at Amazon.com, or go in the bookstore and just see which one pops out at you. It has the topics presented in the way that's most understandable to you. Okay? All right, so on that note, I'd love to help you any way that I can. I'm still learning more about JavaScript every single day, so I may have to refer you to other resources if I don't know an answer off the top of my head, but I'd sure love to give it a shot if you need some help. Let me toss one last shameless plug for my website, www.learnvisualstudio.net, if you're ever interested in learning C# Visual Basic ASP.NET, or if in any other way I can